A quiet welcome to PlotFall. Tonight, we follow the silent footsteps of those who once left everything behind. Not for gold, not for glory, but for the promise of something sacred. They were pilgrims, and their destination was Jerusalem. But this was no peaceful walk through sunlit fields. It was a journey carved by suffering, shaped by desperation, and made dangerous by every step that followed the last. They were not trained for what lay ahead. Most had never traveled beyond their village. Yet they set out, believing that a road soaked in dust and prayer would lead them to forgiveness. But the truth was far less merciful, and for many, they would not survive a single day. Before we begin, if you find values in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, find a comfortable position, dim the light, or maybe turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. In the medieval world, a pilgrimage to Jerusalem was not a journey of leisure. It was a solemn vow, a path of the soul. For some, it began in moments of grief after loss had shaken their world beyond recognition. For others, it began in silence after guilt had grown too heavy to carry alone. People walked for forgiveness, for healing, for promises they had made in whispers, hoping that far away, in the dust and heat of the Holy Land, peace might be waiting. Yet not every step was born from pure choice. Life in the village moved slowly, but memory lingered. Reputation mattered. The church promised salvation, but it also expected penance. To refuse a pilgrimage, especially after a known wrongdoing, was to accept a stain that would not wash away. And so, many walked not only for heaven, but to prove something to the eyes that watched them closely at home. Some pilgrims left in the open, their cloaks brushed with holy water, farewells said beneath church bells. Others departed before dawn, quietly, their reasons too private to speak aloud. A few went willingly. Many went because they felt they had to. Families sometimes sent sons in their stead, too old to walk the path themselves. Widows walked alone with only prayer to shield them. Friends promised to travel together, but illness or war or poverty made many walk alone. The calling was not always holy. Sometimes it was heavy, quiet, and filled with fear. And yet they still went. Every step away from home carried more than dust on their sandals. It carried the weight of sin, of hope, of doubt. It carried the eyes of those they left behind. And so, the road began, not with a grand gesture or a miracle, but with a choice, the step, a burden shared by many, but truly understood only by the ones who walked it. Though every pilgrimage began with a step, the reasons behind that step were rarely simple. For some, it was a journey of the spirit, a sacred promise between themselves and the divine. A quiet hope that walking toward a holy city might bring forgiveness that confession alone could not. But for many others, that same path was shaped just as much by the world around them as by the stirrings within. In the towns and villages scattered across medieval Europe, people lived close together. Lives overlapped. Stories lingered. A known sinner who did not make a pilgrimage might be whispered about for years. A widow who refused to go in her husband's name might be judged behind closed doors. The church held authority over both soul and society, and the expectations were clear. To walk to Jerusalem was to demonstrate repentance, humility, and submission, not only to God, but to one's neighbors. Sometimes the pressure was gentle. A priest suggesting the road east after a long illness or a public failing. A family encouraging their son to show honor. But other times it was sharper, a penance assigned instead of punishment, a reputation that could only be cleansed by a journey so difficult that it left scars. There were pilgrims who went because they truly believed. There were others who went because they feared what might happen if they did not. And there were many who felt both of these things at once, unable to separate duty from devotion. What began as a private calling often became something more public. Villages gathered to bless those departing. Coins were donated. Farewells were said with tears, but also with the quiet relief of those who believed they had done what was expected. For those left behind, The pilgrim's path became a symbol. For those walking it, it became a burden. So the road to Jerusalem was not only sacred, it was social. It was shaped by faith, yes, but also by fear of judgment, fear of dishonor, and the weight of living a life always seen. And so they walked, carrying the invisible expectations of their entire world alongside the hope for something better. Before the blisters, before the thirst, before the silence of unfamiliar lands, there was hope. A soft, flickering kind of hope, often unspoken, but present in the way a traveler packed a simple sack or held their child a little longer before turning toward the road. It was the hope that this journey, however difficult, might bring peace, that something broken within them might be mended by the dust, the prayers, and the distance. That Jerusalem, the holy city whispered of in sermons and scripture, might hold answers to things they had carried too long. They believed, many of them, that walking far enough could cleanse what had been done. That pain might be softened by penance. That each step, no matter how small, brought them closer to something sacred. It was not a loud hope. It did not shout. It barely spoke at all. But it was there, quiet and persistent, like a prayer that refused to end. Alongside that hope came devotion, deeper than words, heavier than reason. The kind of devotion that made a person leave everything behind without knowing if they would ever return. Not a devotion of fire and passion, but of endurance, of quiet trust in the unseen. For some, this faith was all they had. They could not read, they could not write, but they could walk. And so they did, convinced that their footsteps might be heard by heaven, even if no one else noticed them. It was a beautiful kind of beginning, filled with belief and yearning, but also one wrapped in innocence. For few truly understood what lay ahead. The hunger, the sickness, the silence of long roads and long nights, the slow erosion of strength. Still, in those early days, they walked with something close to lightness. The weight of devotion had not yet turned to fatigue. The hope had not yet worn thin. It was a beginning shaped by faith, and by the quiet belief that somewhere, far beyond the horizon, something sacred was waiting to be found. When a pilgrim chose to walk to Jerusalem, they were not simply taking a journey. They were loosening themselves from everything that held them in place. Every stone, every voice, every routine that gave life its rhythm was left behind in quiet farewell. There were no luggage carts or farewell parties. Most pilgrims carried only what they could strap to their backs: a bit of bread, a water skin, perhaps a worn piece of cloth from a loved one. A small token to hold on to in the long silence that waited ahead. Goodbyes were not always grand. Often, they were slow and unfinished, spread out over the days leading up to departure. A lingering glance at the hearth before sunrise. A quiet touch on a doorway one last time. For many, there were tears, but also a certain stillness, as if both the pilgrim and the one staying behind knew that some part of this leaving could not be spoken aloud. For older pilgrims, the journey was a final act. One last chance to walk the earth in service of the soul. For the younger ones, it was a tearing away, from parents, from lovers, from the only life they had ever known. Some never returned. Those left behind knew this, and yet they helped them pack anyway and watched them go. Home, in the medieval world, was often the only safety one ever knew. The roads beyond were uncertain, filled with hunger and danger and strangers. But pilgrims chose to leave that safety behind, guided by something deeper than logic. A longing to be closer to God. Or perhaps, simply, a need to start again. And so they stepped past the village gates, sometimes alone, sometimes in clusters. They walked past familiar fields and fences, past the places where they had grown, wept, and loved. And with every step, the world behind them grew smaller, until it disappeared entirely into the mist of memory. Some looked back, others did not. But whether their goodbye was soft or swift, they all carried the same quiet truth. The life they had known was no longer theirs. From that moment on, they belonged to the road. Before they left, there were decisions to be made. quiet, practical acts that revealed a deeper truth, that the road ahead might not allow for return. Many pilgrims sold what little they had. A wooden stool, a cooking pot, a patch of land that had belonged to their family for generations. These were not choices made lightly. They were the slow unraveling of a life built piece by piece, now traded away for the chance to walk east. Some gave their belongings to the church. Others passed them to children, or to neighbors with promises spoken softly, "Look after this until I come home," though both knew such returns were rare. To travel that far was to walk into uncertainty, and everyone, deep down, understood what that meant. Wills were drawn, not with lawyers or great fanfare, but in simple spoken words, sometimes recorded by a priest or written into church records. A father might entrust his tools to a son. A widow might leave her shawl to a sister. These parting gifts were not signs of wealth, but of awareness. They knew the road was long. They knew it might be final. And though no one wished to speak of it, fear was always present. Not loud, not visible, but it lingered. In the way hands trembled slightly while packing. In the long pauses before doors were closed for the last time. In the extra loaf of bread wrapped not for sustenance, but for comfort. They did not expect comfort, only faith. But even that, for some, was carried with uncertainty. And so, before their first step, they made peace with the life they had lived. Quietly, tenderly, knowing they might not be given the chance to make peace again. There is a moment in every pilgrimage that is quieter than all the rest. It does not happen on the open road or in the distant desert. It happens just beyond the edge of home. After the farewells, after the last shared meal, and the soft prayers murmured at the church door, there comes a point when the familiar ends, when the well-worn path that once led to the fields now leads to something unknown. For many pilgrims, crossing the village boundary was the truest beginning. It was the moment the journey turned real. The gate, the stone wall, the final row of cottages, they marked the line between the world that had shaped them and the one that would now test them. Behind them stood the warmth of family, the voices of neighbors, the safety of knowing what each day might bring. Ahead lay silence, distance, and the slow unraveling of everything they had once depended on. Some paused here, standing still for a long time, as if waiting for the land itself to give permission. Others crossed quickly, afraid that if they looked back, their resolve might falter. A few wept. Most didn't, but in that moment, even the strongest felt the weight of the step they were about to take. To leave one's village in the Middle Ages was more than a change of place. It was a change of identity. The moment you crossed that boundary, you became something else. A traveler, a stranger, a pilgrim. And though the land beyond might be vast and unknown, the first few steps away from home were always the heaviest. Not because of the pack on your shoulders, but because of what you were leaving behind. The rhythm of a life, the comfort of a voice, the certainty of being known. For many, this was the moment when faith stopped being something whispered in prayer and became something lived through silence, through distance, and through the long, lonely miles that followed. The first days on the road often brought surprise. Not from the land or the distance, but from the company. Pilgrims rarely traveled alone. The world beyond the village was too dangerous for solitude. And so they clustered into groups, sometimes formed by shared faith, but more often by necessity. Men and women from different towns, different trades, and different hearts, walking together, not out of friendship, but survival. From a distance, these clusters looked unified, moving slowly like one long ribbon across the earth. But within, they were not always peaceful. They were crowded, uneven, and human. Some were loud. Some were bitter. A few were kind, but many were not. There were merchants hoping to sell goods, thieves posing as believers, outcasts hoping to disappear, and between them, the truly devout, eyes cast forward, feet aching, prayers quiet and uninterrupted. All of them walked under the same sun, but not all for the same reasons. Trust did not come easily. Food was shared, but with caution. Words were exchanged, but only when needed. If someone fell behind, the group did not always wait. If someone grew sick, their space in the circle was quickly filled. Pilgrimage may have been sacred in purpose, but in practice, it often mirrored the world at its most difficult. A place where kindness could be rare and patience even rarer. Arguments broke out. Jealousies festered. At times, pilgrims feared their own companions more than the road ahead. It was not what they expected. Many had believed the path would be filled with prayer and peace, with brotherhood and humility. But the dust was thick, the tempers short, and the holy journey not always holy. And yet, they continued. Some prayed more, trying to hold on to the purpose they had once felt so clearly. Others grew quiet, learning that to survive the road, one needed not only faith, but caution. The road was long. The people beside you changed. But the footsteps and the burden remained. The road stretched on, not in straight lines or clear paths, but in fragments, winding trails, muddy river crossings, and stories passed from one mouth to another. There were no maps, not for those who walked. And even if there had been, few pilgrims could read them. What guided them was less certain than any compass. It was faith. Here's it. The quiet confidence of someone who had spoken to someone else. A cousin, a trader, a monk who once traveled east. You followed the sun. You followed the hills. But mostly you followed hope. At crossroads, pilgrims would pause, waiting for the wisdom of a stranger to point the way. Sometimes that wisdom was kind. Sometimes it was cruel. Entire groups could be led miles off course by a wrong word. Villages expected to be there vanished into empty fields. The road, always changing, never reassured. There was no law to protect you. Outside the towns, outside the watchful eye of lords or churchmen, the world was open and unruled. If you were robbed, there was no one to hear your complaint. If you were lost, no one would come looking. If you disappeared, the road would simply fold your absence into silence. Even asking for directions became a gamble. A kind villager might feed you and send you east. Another might lie or worse, follow. And yet still they walked. Not because the path was clear, but because the need was stronger than the fear. They trusted in fragments, in distant church bells, in the rhythm of the sun, in the company of fellow travelers, however flawed. Faith filled the space that maps could not. It was faith that kept them moving forward, even when nothing else made sense. A blind kind of trust, not in the road, but in the hope that Jerusalem still waited at the far end of it. The road was long, but illness traveled faster than any foot could carry. In the quiet stillness of a morning camp, a cough might echo, soft at first, barely noticed. By evening, another would follow. And within days, the group that had walked together in prayer and silence would begin to scatter, not from destination, but from fear. Pilgrims lived close. They slept side by side in fields, huddled beneath carts and trees, drinking from the same streams, sharing scraps of food with weathered hands. There were no doctors among them, no clean bandages, no knowledge of what truly caused disease, only suspicion, faith, and often helplessness. When someone fell ill, the group's rhythm changed. The walk slowed. Voices grew quiet. Some offered prayer. Others kept their distance. And if the sickness did not pass, the person was often left behind, not from cruelty, but from necessity. The road did not wait. Dysentery, born from unclean water and exhausted bodies, struck often and swiftly. Simple cuts, left unattended, turned to infection. Fever stole minds as easily as strength. And through it all, the fear of plague lingered in the background, a quiet, invisible shadow that no one could name, but all had heard of. There was no medicine, no healing herbs beyond what a fellow traveler might guess at. Some pilgrims carried charms or relics, believing they could ward off illness. Others whispered prayers to saints whose names they barely remembered. But most knew, deep down, that if sickness came, there was little that could be done. And when death came, as it often did, it was quiet. A A still figure beside the road. A shallow grave dug before sunrise. A whispered prayer, and then the journey resumed. Grief was carried forward, folded into each step, until the rhythm of the walk dulled it into silence. For those who remained, the road grew heavier, not just with dust and distance, but with the knowledge that each mile forward might be their last. Faith endured, but it was tested, and the holy city, still so far away, seemed at times more like a dream than a destination. As the days wore on and the road unfolded through forest and plain, a quiet truth began to settle over the hearts of the pilgrims, one that was hard to name and harder still to bear. When someone grew too sick to walk, too fevered to speak, or too weak to rise, the group around them often faltered. Whispers were exchanged, eyes turned downward, and slowly, painfully, the choice was made. The sick were left behind. Not always with cruelty, not always with haste. Sometimes a cloak was laid gently over their chest, or a flask left beside them, half full. A whispered prayer might be spoken, or a hand clasped in silence before the others moved on. But the road did not allow for long goodbyes. Survival required movement. To stay too long was to risk becoming the next one to fall. And so, the sick were left behind. In the mud, beneath trees, along the edges of streams. Places where birds called and wind whispered, but no one came. There were no hospitals, no shelters, only the earth and the fading breath of someone who had once walked with hope. Sometimes they were found by others and taken in, sometimes not. Often, their final moments were spent alone, watching the backs of companions grow smaller with each step. This was the silent cruelty of the pilgrimage, not in violence or betrayal, but in the cold necessity of choosing life over compassion again and again. A choice made not out of heartlessness, but exhaustion, desperation. And for those who walked on, the road never felt quite the same. They carried the memory of the ones left behind, etched into the rhythm of their steps. The road to Jerusalem was never a clean path. It was marked by the ones who did not finish it. The road to Jerusalem was not paved in marble or gold. It was paved in silence, in dust, and in memory. And sometimes, memory took the shape of a small mound beside the path, barely noticeable unless one was looking for it. When a pilgrim died, and many did, the group did what it could. Not out of obligation, but out of the soft, flickering sense that even those forgotten by the world deserved a place to rest. The body would be lifted gently, when strength allowed, and carried just a short distance from the road. A shallow grave was dug, earth moved with bare hands or the flat edge of a worn blade. There was no priest, no choir, only the wind and the breath of those still living. Often, a simple cross was made, a piece of driftwood or the broken handle of a walking stick pressed into the earth to mark the place. Nothing ornate, nothing lasting, but something to say, a soul passed here. These crude markers dotted the roads in places pilgrims rarely spoke of afterward. They would pass one, glance at it, and walk a little quieter. Each cross was a reminder, a name lost but a path shared, a fellow traveler who had hoped for something sacred and instead had become part of the road itself. No records were kept, no dates carved. The world moved on, and yet, for a brief moment, the road bowed its head in memory. And so the journey continued, through valleys and forests, across windswept fields where wooden crosses leaned with time. The road was long, but it remembered. In its own quiet way, it carried the pilgrims who could not carry themselves. For many pilgrims, the spiritual cost of the journey was clear from the beginning. The prayers, the sacrifices, the faith it would demand. But few were prepared for the price measured in coins, in tolls, and in quiet extortion. The road to Jerusalem, though sacred in story, was very much part of the world, and the world, as always, found ways to profit from devotion. Each region the pilgrims crossed belonged to someone. A minor noble, a local baron, a city-state with its own rules and guards, and each one had hands outstretched. Tolls were collected at bridges, sometimes at gates, sometimes at crossroads where no toll had ever existed before. A uniformed man might appear from a shack, or simply from the trees, holding a ledger or a weapon. The price varied: a silver coin, a loaf of bread, a favor. But it was always expected, and questioning it rarely ended well. Some towns demanded payment simply to pass through. Others imposed a pilgrim's tax, a fee for being a guest in their holy land. They spoke of it as protection, as tribute, as a small price for using their roads. But to the pilgrims, tired, hungry, and poor, it often felt like punishment. Even holy orders were not exempt from this quiet economy. Monasteries that should have offered sanctuary sometimes required payment for a bed of straw or a bowl of broth. A blessing, once given freely, now came with a price. And there were others, too, less official, more dangerous. Bands of self-proclaimed protectors who shadowed the roads, offering security in exchange for coin. Refusal was risky. These men could disappear just as easily as they appeared, often with your money, and sometimes with more. Faith had brought the pilgrims here, but faith did not fill their stomachs, nor protect their coin purses. The road, as it turned out, belonged not to the holy, but to the powerful. And yet they continued, sometimes with clenched teeth, sometimes in tears, because for many, the journey had already cost too much to turn back. The road to Jerusalem was meant to bring pilgrims closer to the divine. But at nearly every turn, there were those who saw faith not as something sacred, but as something to sell. In market stalls near crossroads, in the shadowed corners of inns, even within the walls of humble chapels, relics were presented with soft voices and reverent hands. A splinter from the true cross, they would say. A tear of the Virgin Mary. A thread from the robe of St. James. Wrapped in cloth, nestled in wood, made to look precious, made to feel holy. But most were lies. The sellers knew that pilgrims were desperate, weary, hopeful, frightened. They knew these men and women carried few coins, but hearts full of longing. And that was enough. With each purchase, the buyer believed they were safer, closer to God, more likely to survive the journey ahead. The relics may have been false, but the need behind them was real. And then there were indulgences. Promises written in ink and offered with solemn words, that this paper, blessed and sealed, could cleanse your sins, shorten your suffering, perhaps even guarantee your place in heaven. But the seals were often forged, the blessings never given. And yet people paid. Again and again. Some of these peddlers wore robes. Some spoke with the cadence of priests. Others looked like travelers themselves, sharing stories and miracles, always followed by a quiet offer, for just 1 coin more. To walk the road was to carry both your soul and your purse through a world where the two were often mistaken for each other. And as the miles passed, many pilgrims learned, painfully, that not all who smiled in the name of God were walking in his direction. But what could they do? Turn back? Abandon hope? Most pressed forward, clutching their little relics close, still whispering prayers over bones that once belonged to animals, over cloth cut from nothing more than a beggar's cloak. Because belief, once awakened, does not easily sleep again, even when betrayed. By the time many pilgrims reached the middle stretch of their journey, they no longer resembled the people who had once stood at the gates of their villages. Their faces were thinner, the color in their cheeks faded, their sandals worn down to the stitching. Every step carried not just their weight, but the burden of weeks, sometimes months, on the road. Food was harder to find. Shelter, even more so. And the coins they once tucked carefully into hidden corners of their packs were nearly gone. What little they had left, they guarded with a quiet desperation. Not because they were greedy, but because they knew how quickly a day could turn if hunger struck, or if illness demanded medicine, or if a toll gate blocked their way. But even now, they still believed. Not always with joy, not with the naive hope they once carried, but with something smaller, quieter, more stubborn. A belief that all of this suffering had to mean something. That at the end of the dust and pain, there would be light. That God would see their journey and smile. It was this hope that made them vulnerable. The swindlers came dressed in many forms. Some wore the robes of monks. Others disguised themselves as fellow pilgrims. A few simply stood by the road and offered help with a voice too warm, too practiced. They promised holy water drawn from sacred springs, scrolls bearing indulgences signed with stolen names, bones of saints, though they were more often from animals, whittled to look ancient. They sold not just objects, but reassurance, the idea that salvation could be bought, that suffering could be shortened, that all the fear in a pilgrim's heart could be eased, if only they gave just one more coin. And the pilgrims, exhausted and worn thin by miles and sorrow, gave what they could. A silver piece tucked in the hem of a sleeve, a ring passed down from a mother's hand, a handful of bread they'd meant to save for the next day's walk. Afterward, when the deception became clear, there was no anger, only silence, a heavy quiet that settled in the chest and stayed there. Some looked to the sky and prayed anyway. Others said nothing, afraid that speaking would break something fragile within them. They did not return home. They did not turn back. They simply walked on, not because they trusted the road, but because turning around would mean all they had lost was for nothing. And so the road continued, filled with pilgrims who had paid more than they ever expected, not just in coin, but in trust, in dignity, and in the painful realization that even on a holy journey, not all faces were kind. As the road wound further south and east, the land began to change, not just in landscape, but in rhythm. The trees looked different. The way the wind moved through the grasses changed. Even the sound of human voices lost their familiar tones. And for many pilgrims, this was when the journey began to feel truly foreign, not just far from home, but untethered from anything they had known. The dialects they once understood disappeared first. Then came signs written in alphabets they could not read. Conversations drifted by like streams they could not step into, words too quick, too fluid to catch. And with this silence came vulnerability. To be among people and yet unable to speak was its own kind of isolation. Pilgrims relied on gestures, on smiles, on the uncertain kindness of strangers. Some locals offered bread. Others offered only cold eyes. And without the comfort of shared language, it was impossible to know which was which until it was too late. Laws, too, shifted like sand. In one village, a gesture of gratitude might be returned with a bow. In another, that same gesture could be taken as insult. A curious look might be seen as suspicion. A hand outstretched might invite trouble. There were no guides, no warnings. Only instinct and the hope that it would be enough. Pilgrims sometimes crossed borders without even realizing it. One day you were walking through the land of one prince, the next through a valley ruled by a warlord. There was no consistency in what was safe, what was expected, or what was allowed. And should trouble come, a stolen sack, a false accusation, an accidental offense, the pilgrim had no words to defend themselves. Just hands, eyes, silence. Some paid fines they did not understand. Others were beaten and sent on their way. A few simply vanished, swallowed up by the space between cultures that had no reason to shelter them. It was not hatred that met them most often, just unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity, when mixed with fear and desperation, could become dangerous. Still they walked. Through villages where no one smiled back. Through markets where prices changed with the color of their cloak. Through temples where they were not welcome, and fields where they were not seen. Every step forward meant shedding a little more certainty. And yet they pressed on, not because they understood the land they walked through, but because they still hoped to reach a land where they might finally be understood. There were no guides for how to behave across the many lands the pilgrims crossed. No books to explain the subtle gestures, no signs to warn of what should never be done. A glance held too long. A foot placed where it should not be. A question asked with the wrong tilt of the voice. The smallest things in unfamiliar lands could become offenses. And the danger wasn't always loud. It often came quietly, like a rising chill in the air. A conversation would stop. Eyes would narrow. A villager might step between the pilgrim and their path. Other times, it was swift and brutal. A slap, a shove, a stone thrown in warning. There was no time to explain. No words that could bridge the distance between cultures with different gods, different rules, different wounds. Some pilgrims, too tired or too trusting, wandered into sacred spaces uninvited. Others offered coins with the wrong hand or touched an item not meant to be touched. To them, it was innocent, a moment of curiosity or habit. But to the locals, it was disrespect. Or worse, a threat. And sometimes, the danger came not from the outside, but from within their own ranks. The road was filled with all kinds, not just the faithful, but the desperate, the proud, the broken. Tensions simmered beneath the surface of pilgrim groups. Arguments over food, over sleep, over the path forward. A misunderstood word in the dark could lead to fists. A disagreement could turn violent before the first light of morning. There were no courts, no appeals, only the rough justice of the road. And often, those who were weakest, the foreigner, the silent one, the traveler who could not defend themselves, bore the harshest weight. To be a pilgrim was not only to walk across lands unfamiliar, but to do so with a heart constantly open and exposed. It required not just faith, but forgiveness, for others and often for oneself. And still they walked, bruised in body, shaken in spirit, because even when misunderstood, even when punished for what they could not have known, they believed that somewhere ahead there was a place that would recognize their suffering and make it holy. As the miles wore on, a quieter truth settled into every pilgrim's bones. There was no one coming to help. Once you left the familiar lands of your lord, your king, your village priest, the oaths and protections that once wrapped around you like a cloak disappeared. You were no longer a subject, no longer a citizen. You were simply a body on the road. One of many. The laws of your homeland did not stretch this far. The crown under which you had once lived, prayed, married, farmed, had no weight in the villages of foreign soil. And if something went wrong, a theft, a beating, a disappearance, no one was bound to investigate. No message would be sent back home. No knights would ride out. The world was wide, and you were small inside it. Even in towns where order existed, it was not your order. Justice favored locals, or those who could pay. And pilgrims were often neither. A misunderstanding in the market could lead to prison. A false accusation could end in violence. Sometimes all it took was silence, a refusal to answer a question you didn't understand, to be judged as suspicious. There were places, too, where no laws ruled at all. Open roads between territories. Forests where soldiers had no patrol. Ravines where even the brave did not follow. Here, fate held sway, and fate, like the wind, changed often. You might meet kindness, a shepherd sharing figs and warmth by a fire, or you might meet those who saw only your pack, your weakness, your distance from help. And so, pilgrims learned to be quiet, to lower their eyes, to offer smiles without promises. They moved through the world like shadows, present, but barely touching it. Not because they lacked courage, but because they had learned what the road required. That survival, more often than not, came from being unnoticed. They had set out with prayers on their lips. Now they walked with silence in their throats, hoping it would carry them further than any name or title ever could. By the time the Holy Land was near, when the dust carried the scent of the sea and the air grew still with heat, many pilgrims expected peace. They had made it, or so they believed. But the hardest part of the journey was yet to come. The sun here was not the sun they knew. It did not warm gently, it pressed down. Heavy and bright, it turned stone to fire and air to stillness. Shade became rare and precious. A tree could feel like a chapel. A trickle of water, like a miracle. The wells, once marked on tattered maps, once spoken of by travelers in taverns, were often dry, or too deep to draw from. or surrounded by people who charged coin for a single cup. And so, the Pilgrims learned to ration water the way they once rationed hope, slowly, carefully, not knowing how long it had to last. Their bodies, already worn thin, began to fail. Lips cracked, vision blurred. Some fainted mid-step and did not rise. The heat did not feel cruel. It felt indifferent, like a silent God that did not hear their prayers. Food became another silent enemy. The bread was strange. The spices unfamiliar. The meat, when it came, was tough or sour or simply gone. Some could not eat. Others ate too quickly and were sick. Markets did not cater to wanderers with no coin. And the kindness of strangers, always a hope, could not be counted on where survival was hard for everyone. The land itself, sacred and silent, offered no comfort. It shimmered in the distance like a promise half remembered. They had come so far. They had imagined angels waiting at the gate. Instead, they found stone and sun, silence and thirst. And still they walked, even as their knees trembled, even as their mouths dried, because turning back was no longer an option, and forward was the only direction where faith might still bloom. The road in the Holy Land did not curve gently. It stretched like a ribbon pulled too tight, winding across pale hills and hard, cracked valleys where even the wind seemed tired. There were no trees to shield the sun, no clouds to soften its gaze. Just the light, endless and sharp, falling across shoulders already bent by too many miles. Pilgrims marched slowly now, not because they were cautious, but because they no longer had the strength to move quickly. Each step became a decision. Each hill, a quiet test. Their sandals were worn to near nothing. Feet blistered, skin cracked. The salt from their own sweat stung their eyes. And with each breath, the air seemed to offer less. Water was no longer just a need. It became a thought that never left. They dreamed of it while awake. A shaded well, a damp cloth, a simple, cold cup. But the land gave little. Springs were dry. Streams ran shallow and brown. And those few places where water could be found were sometimes guarded, not by soldiers, but by hunger, suspicion, or the sharp price of a local merchant who saw an opportunity in their desperation. The strongest pilgrims helped carry the weakest, until they couldn't. And then, those once helped were left behind. Not cruelly, not carelessly, but because the road had made everything a calculation of survival. To stop too long meant becoming still forever. Many did. You would see them slumped beneath olive trees, or curled beneath the shade of a wall, too tired to speak. Eyes open but unseeing, breathing shallow, dust on their skin, dust in their mouths. They were not crying. They were beyond that. The body does not break all at once. It unravels, first with tremors, then confusion, then silence, and still others walked past them. Not because they had no heart, but because they had no choice. This was not cruelty. It was what the road demanded. They had come for salvation. They had dreamed of holy cities, shining domes, the kiss of relics in candlelight. But here, in this heat, in this stretch of blinding earth, all they knew was how small they were, how fragile a human body truly is, when stripped of shade, water, and mercy. And yet, the line of pilgrims continued, dust in their hair, fire in their lungs, each step saying wordlessly, "Please let me live to see it." Food, once a comfort, once a joy, became something distant, something that lived more in memory than in reach. What pilgrims carried with them from home was never meant to last this long. Hardened bread, salted meat, a few dried fruits or grains, meant to be shared slowly, carefully. But time and weather are cruel companions. The bread grew mold. The meat turned sour. Even the simplest things, a handful of nuts, a small wheel of cheese, spoiled in the heat, crumbled from the jostling of the road, or were lost altogether. Worse still, food attracted attention. In towns, the sight of a pilgrim holding even a crust of bread could draw eyes, hungry eyes. It wasn't rare for food to be taken by force. Not always with malice. sometimes just hunger meeting hunger. But the outcome was the same. A meal vanished, a belly left empty, and a deeper fear growing in the heart of the traveler who now had one less piece of comfort to hold on to. In places where markets did exist, prices were steep. Locals saw pilgrims not as guests, but as passing coin purses. And what was sold was often of the lowest quality. Spoiled lentils, grain with worms, watered wine, food that would fill the mouth but turn the stomach. And still, the pilgrims bought it, because the alternative was worse. And then there were nights where there was nothing. No vendors, no inns, just the open sky and an ache in the stomach that wouldn't sleep. Some would go 2, even 3 days without a proper meal. They would walk while dizzy, pray while shaking, and still hope, always hope, that the next hill, the next bend, the next village might offer a loaf, a bowl, a kindness. But the road was long, and hunger, once planted, does not stay still. It creeps into the bones, weakens the voice, slows the feet. And so, the pilgrims learned something terrible and true, that salvation cannot be swallowed, that faith does not quiet the stomach, and that, in the heat of the Holy Land, even the holiest hearts must contend with the most human needs. After months of walking, of cold mornings and burning afternoons, of hunger, fear, and prayer whispered into the wind, the gates of Jerusalem finally rose before them. The city long dreamt of, the names sung in churches, the place where the divine and the earthly were said to meet. Pilgrims had imagined it endlessly, golden light falling on white stone, quiet streets lined with holy men, angels in silence just beyond sight. They had pictured peace, release, and the kind of stillness that comes only when one has reached the end of something sacred. But what they found was noise. Jerusalem was not empty. It was not quiet. It did not wait patiently to welcome them. It roared. Merchants shouted in tongues they could not follow. Soldiers stood at gates with hands on their weapons. Pilgrims jostled shoulder to shoulder through narrow alleys, each one lost in their own exhaustion, their own expectation. The sacred city, instead of feeling divine, felt harsh, walled in and crowded. Its streets hot with dust, its markets sharp with the smell of animals, sweat, and smoke. And the danger, it had not been left behind. In fact, it felt sharper here, as if the city's holiness made every flaw more painful to see. Theft was common, tempers short, space was scarce and sold at steep price. Some pilgrims were turned away from shrines they had crossed continents to see, not by cruelty, but by crowds too thick to pass. There were those who wept, not in joy, but in grief, because the Jerusalem of their hearts had not met them, because they had given so much to reach this place, and the reward felt distant. They had not come expecting comfort, but they had expected something else, something gentle, something sacred. Instead, the city throbbed with noise and need. Not unholy, but utterly, painfully human. And yet, even in this disappointment, they did not curse the road. Some found meaning in the challenge. Others wept and knelt anyway, because kneeling was the only thing left to do. The road had not given them the city they imagined, but it had given them a truth few others would ever understand, that sometimes the holiest part of a journey is not where it ends, but what it changes within you. Though pilgrims had long envisioned Jerusalem as a city of divine light, its stones were warm not just from sun, but from centuries of conflict. For many who arrived with trembling legs and blistered feet, what awaited was not peace, but scars. The city had been a battlefield more than once. Its gates had opened and closed to conquerors, to crusaders, to caliphs, to kings whose names were spoken with reverence in some lands and hatred in others. Blood had been spilled here not just in war, but in the name of God, and the earth remembered. Quietly, without judgment, but it remembered. Walls were cracked, streets patched where fire once swept through. Entire quarters of the city bore the weight of past sieges, homes rebuilt on rubble, temples scarred by flame, wells gone dry from long campaigns. The air held a quiet tension, like the pause before an argument that never truly ended. Pilgrims could feel it. Even those who did not know the stories could sense that peace here was not settled. It was negotiated day by day, hour by hour. Muslim guards watched over holy sites that Christian pilgrims had dreamt of touching. Jewish families walked streets lined with churches. Languages collided in the marketplace. Latin, Arabic, Greek, Hebrew, not with harmony, but with caution. There were places where pilgrims were warned not to enter. Places where they had to pay just to kneel. And places where one wrong step, one wrong word, could awaken anger too old to name. This was not a city at war. But it was not a city at rest either. It was a city held together by memory, by faith, and by tension that pulsed just beneath the surface. To the pilgrim who had dreamed only of divine silence, this felt disorienting, as if holiness had been buried beneath layers of human pain. But still they stayed. They lit candles where they could, touched stone where soldiers allowed, prayed beside strangers who had traveled just as far, just as long. They understood now, Jerusalem had never been a promise. It had always been a test. After so many miles, so many aching steps and whispered prayers, one might think the hardest part of the pilgrimage was behind them. But for many, the most painful lesson came not on the road, but at the gates of the very shrines they had dreamt of touching. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Mount of Olives, the sacred steps believed to carry the memory of Christ. These places were not empty, waiting patiently for pilgrims to arrive. They were crowded, guarded, and often locked behind rituals, rules, and tolls. Some were simply turned away. Too many people. The doors closed early. A festival restricted access. Or guards, often weary from their duties, suspicious of strangers, decided who could pass and who could not. No reasons were needed, just a gesture, a nod, a hand held out in refusal. Others were asked to pay. Not donations, not offerings, but fees. Coins handed over just to walk a few steps further, just to light a candle, just to kneel. And for those who had given everything, sold land, said goodbye to family, walked for months, the demand felt like a wound. Some paid gladly, grateful just to be close. Others wept as they stepped back, denied not by heaven, but by human hands. Even those who made it inside sometimes found little peace. Pushed by crowds, rushed by waiting lines, surrounded by merchants selling trinkets that claimed to hold holy power, but looked more like souvenirs of disappointment. And still, they prayed. Because what else was there to do? They closed their eyes and imagined what could not be seen. They pressed their palms to cold stone and tried to feel the stories they had been told. They whispered the names of their loved ones, their sins, their hopes, hoping that the silence of the shrine, even if shared with 100 others, would carry their words upward. It wasn't the vision they had carried in their hearts. But in that moment, with dust still on their robes and pain still in their bones, it had to be enough. And somehow, for many to us, the idea of a return journey was, for many, more a whisper than a plan. It lingered in the back of the mind, a soft promise made to family, to lovers, to aging parents back home. I will return. I will come back changed, but I will come back. But the truth settled slowly, like the fine dust on a pilgrim's cloak. Returning was not certain. In fact, it was rare. For many, Jerusalem was the last stop, not just of their journey, but of their life. Some fell ill not long after arriving. The body, stretched beyond its limits, finally gave in. A fever caught in a crowded alley. A wound that festered quietly. A stomach turned from spoiled food or water too brackish to drink. Even joy could break a body worn thin. The overwhelming release of finally arriving collapsing whatever strength had remained. They died quietly, most of them, in shared rooms of pilgrim hospices, in alleys under cloth shelters, on rooftops where the night air felt cooler. There were no grand ceremonies, no family gathered close, just other pilgrims who whispered prayers over still bodies before moving on. Others simply stayed because they could not imagine walking again. The thought of retracing every mile, every danger, it was too much. So they remained. Some became caretakers, helping the next wave of pilgrims. Some joined monasteries. Others faded into the edges of the city, forgotten even by the roads that had once carried them there. But perhaps the hardest truth of all was this: many who died had believed they would live. They had written letters they never sent, dreamt of reunions that would never come. And somewhere far away, in cold villages, on quiet farms, loved ones waited for news that never arrived. And yet, for the ones who died in Jerusalem, there was also a strange kind of peace. To pass in the land they had dreamed of, to rest in the shadow of the shrines, to be buried where prayers echoed daily across stone and sky. They had not come to return. Not really. They had come to arrive. Even for those who lived, whose bodies held together just long enough to complete the journey, the road home often faded from possibility into impossibility. Because while the path to Jerusalem had been long and cruel, it had at least been filled with direction. Forward. Forward through hills and forests, deserts and markets. Forward toward a dream that, however flawed, still shone ahead. But once that dream had been reached, the road behind no longer shimmered with hope. It stretched backward, uncertain and empty. And far. Many pilgrims found themselves with nothing left. The coins tucked away for emergencies had been spent on water, on passage, on food gone bad. The boots on their feet were torn. Their strength, poured into each mile coming here, had little left to give for the return. Some tried to find work, begging for scraps or lifting heavy loads in markets just to afford another day. Others sought help from monasteries or hospices, but they were already crowded with others in the same quiet desperation. And then there were those who were not even given the option. Certain regions, certain rulers had restrictions. Passes were needed, bribes expected, identities questioned. Some pilgrims had entered under tenuous permissions, traveling through contested lands where political winds shifted like sand. By the time they sought to leave, the doors had closed behind them. There were also darker reasons. Some pilgrims were forced to stay as servants, having traded away their freedom for safety or passage. Others had debts they could not repay, bound to agreements made when hunger outweighed judgment. And so they lingered. Not citizens, not visitors, just quiet figures in the corners of a city they had once longed for, sweeping courtyards, lighting lamps, kneeling at shrines as if they still prayed for something other than survival. They watched newer pilgrims arrive, bright-eyed, sunburned, full of stories about the road, and they did not speak. Not because they had no words, but because the journey had given them truths that words could not carry. Jerusalem had been their destination, but not their end. They had not returned. They had remained, not out of choice, but out of quiet necessity. Forgotten by the lands they came from, claimed now only by silence. The road back, for those few who dared to walk it, was not merely a retracing of steps. It was something else entirely. Something lonelier. Something darker. The outward journey had been hard, but it had always carried direction. It had always carried hope. Pilgrims had moved forward with the quiet fire of faith in their chests, one eye on the horizon and the other on heaven. But the return held no such promise. No vision of shrines. No dream of salvation. Only distance. Only the long shadow of what they had endured. And their bodies, thin now, sun-worn, bent with miles, bore the weight of both memory and fatigue. Every muscle pulled taut. Every joint ached. Food was scarcer, water less clean, and their faith, though still alive, had become quieter. Not broken, just weathered. But it wasn't only their bodies that made them vulnerable. It was what they carried. Even the humblest pilgrim, returning from Jerusalem, might bring with them a token. A relic bought from a stall outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. A vial of water said to be from the Jordan. A smooth stone, a folded blessing, a scrap of cloth. These were treasures of the soul, but to others they were coin. and the road was watched. Bandits did not need to guess where pilgrims walked. The return routes were well worn, just like the bodies that walked them. Thieves waited in the foothills, in the bends of wooded paths, beneath ruined arches along Roman roads long abandoned by law. They knew the signs: the tattered cloak, the sun-split sandals, the slow gait of someone carrying not gold, but exhaustion. Sometimes they stole and spared lives, but not always. Some pilgrims were stripped bare and left to wander without shoes, without water, without dignity. Others were taken entirely, their belongings, their tokens, even their names, fading into the wilderness. A few tried to fight back and were never seen again. Even traveling in groups offered no guarantee. Raiders could be organized. Some wore no insignia, no banner, no name. Others were disillusioned mercenaries, or even former pilgrims themselves, broken by failure and now turned desperate. Those who survived attacks rarely spoke of them, not because they lacked the words, but because the telling seemed to reopen the wound. The silence that followed was heavy, and it traveled with them. It was the silence of knowing that the world could still take, even after you had given everything. So they walked in silence, through dust and dusk, through places where the road forked and no one knew which turn was safe, through valleys where the wind carried no sound but their own footfall. And when they finally reached their homeland, they no longer spoke of a triumphant return. They had been to the holiest place on earth, and they had returned not with celebration, but with a kind of haunted peace, a reverence too deep to speak aloud, a grief too soft for tears. Home did not feel the same. The people did not look the same. The world, once wide, now felt narrow, because they had seen it all: the beauty, the brutality, the thin thread between the two. They were survivors, yes, but they were also something else. Pilgrims no longer walking, but never truly finished. In the end, the journey was not measured in miles, nor in the sacred stones kissed or relics tucked away. It was measured in quiet changes, in what was left behind, and in what remained. Many had set out on pilgrimage with such clear intentions: to be cleansed of sin, to be healed, to fulfill a vow, to find peace, either in this world or the next. Their hopes had been heavy, but simple. Their footsteps, guided by prayer and the soft pressure of belief. Each had a private ache they carried, folded deep beneath their tunic, hidden even from their traveling companions. But Jerusalem, for all its holiness, offered no answers. No voice spoke from heaven. No miracle made the road disappear beneath their feet. And no shrine, however sacred, could erase the weight of the past or promise a painless future. Some pilgrims knelt in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and felt nothing, not for lack of faith, but because they were too tired to feel anything at all. Others wept, not from joy, but from the quiet grief of realizing that the road had changed them more than the destination ever could. And yet, that change mattered. They had suffered. They had been lied to, betrayed, left behind. But in the silence that followed, in the stillness after the storm, they had also seen the world more clearly than most ever would. They had walked through places where time moved differently, where languages danced and faltered, where kindness was rare and precious. They had felt the sharp edge of hunger and the strange comfort of strangers who shared bread without asking a name. They had watched stars rise above deserts so vast they seemed like oceans made of dust. And in those moments, fleeting as they were, something sacred had passed through them. No one truly returned whole. That was not what pilgrimage gave. But many returned deeper. They had lost comfort, innocence, and sometimes even their place in the world they once called home. Yet in its place, they had gained something harder to name. Not wisdom, exactly, not peace, but a kind of quiet knowing of what the world is, of how vast it can be, and of how small and brief a soul can feel upon it. And for some, that was enough. But not all returned, and not all were remembered. Along the winding roads that stretched from cold stone villages to the golden haze of Jerusalem, There were thousands whose names were never written down. No letters sent. No tombstones carved. No record kept, except the fading memory of someone who once watched them disappear over a distant hill. They were pilgrims, too, though time has long since brushed away their footprints. Some died quietly in the night under unfamiliar stars. Others slipped away in cities far from home, where no one knew the language they spoke or the prayers they whispered. A few were buried by kind hands, with rough wooden crosses or stones pressed gently into the earth. Many more were simply swallowed by the road, by sand, by sea, by silence. Their stories ended somewhere between where they began and where they hoped to arrive. Not in cathedrals, not in journals, but in the wind that moves across the forgotten paths of history. And yet, they mattered. Every torn sandal, every blistered foot, every tear shed in prayer. It was all part of something larger than any one life. They carried devotion in its rawest form. They walked not because they were promised answers, but because they believed in asking the question anyway, even if no one heard it, even if the only reply came in the quiet. And so, before a single blister is formed, before the sun burns the skin or the body weakens from hunger, there is only this moment, the threshold. The moment when a man or woman, old or young, pauses at the edge of everything familiar and considers, for the last time, the world they are leaving behind. The cottage door has closed. The path winds downward. The sky looks unchanged, but something is different now, because every step taken from here no longer belongs to daily life. It belongs to the journey. The word pilgrimage sounds noble, but to the one walking it, it is filled with quiet fear. Fear of what the road might demand. Fear of one's own weakness. Fear that the prayers spoken with trembling hands may not be answered. And yet, beneath the fear is something softer. A longing that even suffering cannot silence. A belief, faint, flickering, but alive, that perhaps by walking far enough, one can find peace that does not fade with the seasons. They are not warriors, these pilgrims. They are not armored. They are not praised. They walk not with pride, but with a heavy humility. Some have been sent by others. Some walk to escape whispers. Some believe in miracles. Others only believe in obligation. But they all walk, and in walking, they cross into a world that no longer bends to comfort or control. Along the way, they will shed things: food, belongings, companionship. And slowly, they will also shed certainty, the illusion of safety, and the image of who they once thought they were. This is not the journey of a day or a week, but of seasons. A crossing of mountains, empires, and selves. The road will stretch so long that memories of home will begin to fade like old dreams. They will forget the smell of bread in their own kitchen, the creak of the wooden bench, the way the river near their homes sounded in spring. And in its place, there will be silence, wind, prayers mumbled half asleep, and the sound of others breathing beside them, equally broken, equally determined. Some will never reach Jerusalem. Their bodies will lie in places with names they cannot pronounce. Their deaths will go unwitnessed by family, marked only by a pile of stones or a wooden cross planted in foreign soil. And yet, even in their loss, the journey will be complete. For the pilgrimage was never truly about reaching the city. It was about enduring the road, and what that endurance revealed. They will lose weight. They will lose sleep. They will lose people. But they will gain an understanding that comfort hides truth, and that suffering, though cruel, does not lie. And in the end, those who survive will no longer be the ones who left. And so, here, as we linger at the beginning, before the hardship sets in, before the hunger and dust and illness, let us remember this, that every great journey begins not with a step, but with a surrender, a letting go of the world we know in the hope that something greater lies ahead. Not always brighter, not always kinder, but deeper, truer. The pilgrims walked because they had to, not in body but in soul. Something pulled them, and they obeyed. And now the path stretches forward. Jerusalem lies far beyond the horizon, behind deserts and dangers and the weariness of many months. But the journey has already begun. The hardest part was never walking the road. It was deciding to leave. So now, the road lies open. The village has disappeared behind the bend, swallowed by distance and memory. What remains is the slow rhythm of footsteps, the sound of breath, and the silence that only begins once the noise of home is gone. There is no turning back. The weight they carry is no longer just the pack on their shoulders, but the quiet burden of everything left unsaid, everything left behind. Each pilgrim walks alone, even among the crowd. For this journey, though shared in space, is deeply private in purpose. They will walk through lands where their name means nothing, where the stars are strange, and where hunger is more familiar than kindness. And yet still, they press forward, not for glory, not for wealth, but because something within them longs to be forgiven, or to understand, or simply to feel something more than the life they left behind. In a world where so little was certain, where illness came without warning and death without reason, this pilgrimage was the one act of intention they could offer. A deliberate choice in a world that rarely allowed for choice at all. And so they go, one step at a time, quite uncelebrated, ordinary. And yet, in that ordinariness, something sacred unfolds. A kind of bravery that doesn't shout, but simply walks. Toward something holy, toward something final, toward Jerusalem. There are moments when the road disappears beneath the dust, when the heat distorts the horizon into a wavering mirage, and doubts creep in like shadows stretching across the path. In these times, the pilgrims do not speak much. Words are too heavy, and none seem large enough to carry what they feel. They share glances instead, brief acknowledgments of weariness and will. A crust of bread passed without ceremony, a hand offered across a difficult ridge, these become the language of the journey. And sometimes, in the hush between steps, they find themselves remembering faces, voices, small moments that once seemed trivial but now shine with unbearable clarity. Regret becomes a companion, but so too does hope, and neither walks faster than the other. The road makes room for both. The seasons shift. Days bleed into one another. Some pilgrims fall behind, claimed by illness or the quiet surrender of the spirit. Others press forward with blistered feet and sunburned shoulders, their bodies frail but their resolve iron-bound. At night, they sleep beneath unfamiliar stars and dream of the road not as it is, but as it began, with promise, with faith. Jerusalem, once a word whispered in the dark with awe and fear, begins to take shape not only as a place but as an idea, the possibility of renewal, of being seen by something greater than the world's cruelty. They do not know what they will find when they arrive. Perhaps only silence, perhaps only stone, but still, they believe it will be different, because they will be different. Something inside them has already shifted, slowly, quietly, like the turning of the earth beneath their feet. And when, at last, the towers rise on the horizon, faint at first, then clear as the morning mist burns away, there are no shouts of triumph, no songs, just a long silence, broken only by the wind. Some weep, some kneel, some do nothing at all, unable to process the enormity of what the journey has become. They have walked through death and doubt, through lands that did not welcome them, through the endless landscape of their own hearts. And now, at the end of it all, they understand that the road never truly ends. Jerusalem was never the destination. It was the reason to begin. The true pilgrimage was always inward, toward the soul, toward the ache that drove them forward. And though their feet may stop, their journey will echo long after, in the silence, in the breath, in the brave, quiet choice to walk at all. And with that, we end our quiet walk through the first chapter of this long and uncertain journey. Thank you for joining today's story with PlotFall, where history drifts slowly and softly into sleep. Until next time, rest well, and may the road ahead always be kind, even in dreams.